It is the year 2036. On the Lunar Gateway, 4 astronauts are celebrating what marks 10 years of being in orbit around the moon. 10 years that NASA has established a permanent human presence orbiting the moon on this tiny station. However, there's also a drama unfolding because the astronauts from NASA realize and have known for quite some time that they are not alone. The Communist Chinese have also established a presence in cislunar space, and during this time, the astronauts aboard the Lunar Gateway have observed some sort of construction taking place deep in Shackleton Crater, where the Chinese have established a surface base. They're not certain as to what they are constructing, and the Chinese government refuses to even acknowledge that this construction is going on. At roughly the same time, a ship begins to approach the Lunar Gateway. All communications from the tiny orbiting base are being jammed by a network of communication satellites that the Chinese have put into place orbiting the moon ahead of time in anticipation of just such a move. Unable to communicate with Earth, the astronauts are confronted with an ultimatum from the approaching taikonauts: surrender or be destroyed. Having no weapons whatsoever to match the missiles that are now locked onto their station, the astronauts on board, 3 Americans and 1 Italian, have no choice but to give in to the taikonauts' demands. The Chinese vessel docks with the station, the taikonauts board, fully armed, and take control. Shortly thereafter, the People's Republic of China announces that they have control of cislunar space, and they defy any government on the planet to try to change this situation. NATO is outraged by this act of aggression and declares war on the People's Republic of China, preparing to deploy substantial military assets off the Chinese coast. However, before their plans can even get started, a meteor, seemingly at random, comes out of the heavens and strikes a strategic target in the United States with the equivalent force of a 20-megaton nuclear device. China then announces that they have a weapon on the lunar surface, a mass driver capable of launching artificial asteroid strikes on any target of their choice on the surface of the planet, and this is their strategic counter to any military threat leveled against their country. They demand that NATO back off, otherwise they will pay a terrible price. Faced with a weapon that they are unable to stop and the possibility of nuclear Armageddon on the horizon, NATO backs down and cedes control of cislunar space to Communist China. Could this possibly happen? Well, given their current actions, it would appear that the American military is taking this threat very seriously, at least the control of cislunar space, and they no longer regard chemical rockets as being a sufficiently advanced technology to guarantee control of this strategic area, and they are investing in something substantially better to give the US military a rapid response capability in cislunar space. My name is Jordan Wright. I was born in the same year that the human race took its first steps on the surface of another world, and then we promptly betrayed those people's legacy by never going back. But now, over half a century later, there's a new breed of pioneers that are seeking to finish what these people set out to do so long ago. But there is trouble as well, so it's time for commentators like me to stop being polite and start getting angry! Now, I'd like to make one thing perfectly clear. I do not believe that the Communist Chinese have an active plan right now to build a lunar mass driver. This, by the way, is an electromagnetic train, essentially, on the moon. Because of its 1/6 gravity, it would have the capability of launching large pieces of metal, say a chunk of iron ore or a piece of tungsten, both of which are present on the moon, and to use it as an artificial asteroid as a strategic weapon on targets on Earth. And this is something that could be emplaced either in Shackleton Crater or on the far side of the moon, out of sight of Earth and completely invulnerable to any counterattacks. This weapon would also be able to eliminate all of our vertical launch capabilities within the first couple of days. And even though we could certainly retaliate by using nuclear weapons against Chinese forces here on Earth and against their civilian population if we wanted to, we would do so knowing that this device would be able to systematically destroy every major city in the United States, or indeed in any country on the planet, at will, until they finally got tired of destroying strategic targets. And this would be the kind of thing that could be very intimidating in international relations. So we need a quick response capability, and this is what the United States Space Force is currently working on by developing nuclear thermal propulsion and other types of nuclear propulsion. And this would allow military assets in low Earth orbit and perhaps even on Earth to respond rapidly to a crisis situation in cislunar space. This project is called the Demonstration Rocket for Agile Cislunar Operations, or the DRACO program, and 3 companies have been secured to deliver this type of technology: General Atomics, Lockheed Martin, and Blue Origin. Now, I've reported on this kind of technology a number of times. It has a huge advantage over chemical rockets in a variety of ways, and NASA has been working on this in order to try to get astronauts to Mars in a shorter span of time, perhaps in 3 months or so. And they've also been working on small nuclear reactors for use on Mars and the Moon called kilopower. However, this is only for surface operations, not for interplanetary or Earth-to-Moon operations, but it is an excellent solution for any sort of smaller settlements on the Moon or Mars, simply because it's not relying on solar power, which can be blocked out by things like dust storms. This is a concept that's been worked on for an extremely long period of time, since the 1960s and even before. We've been working on the idea of using nuclear power in space, both for settlements and for propulsion. However, the military have really been supercharging this idea as of late. The Department of Defense currently has a solicitation for nuclear propulsion systems for small and medium-sized spacecraft, and responses to this solicitation are due no later than 11:59 Eastern Standard Time on September 23rd. Now, any sort of nuclear propulsion is going to require the use of a small nuclear reactor, preferably powered by uranium instead of plutonium for safety. After all, the Russians did launch one particular rocket that had plutonium on board. The rocket was lost, and radioactive waste was spread across the planet as a result. Not a huge amount, and it wasn't a massive nuclear disaster, but nevertheless something that we would prefer to avoid. Therefore, a low-yield uranium solution is far better, not only for nuclear propulsion or for uses in space colonies, but also for smaller communities in rural areas throughout the world. Not only are American companies working on this solution, but also companies like Rolls-Royce in the United Kingdom, for use not only in rural areas from these major nations, but also for third world countries. So this kind of nuclear nuclear technology actually has many applications besides just military use. However, where the Space Force has their efforts concentrated is on nuclear propulsion and a fast reaction capability to cislunar space, and they have very good reasons to be pursuing this. According to defense analyst Eugene Holtz, and I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, article linked in the description, quote, "There's a reasonable chance that techno-nationalism could spill over into developing space weapons. China's more militarized approach to technology might have an implication for an arms race. If a hot war comes, it's going to be tremendously destructive. There's a risk of really large-scale destruction," unquote. So developing this type of propulsion would allow U.S. military assets and assets of our allies to respond to any sort of crisis in cislunar space or any development of military capabilities in this area. It wouldn't just be something like a mass driver. It could also be reconnaissance. It could be some other type of missile system on the far side of the moon. A variety of different ways to militarize the moon, and this needs to be responded to. And the best way to respond is using superior forms of propulsion, namely nuclear thermal or nuclear electric propulsion, amongst others. So what makes this type of propulsion superior? Why is it better? Well, in the case of nuclear thermal propulsion, you're using the vast amount of energy from the nuclear reaction to superheat hydrogen fuel and accelerate it out the nozzle at a rate of speed 2 to 3 times that of conventional chemical propellants. In the case of nuclear electric propulsion, you're using nuclear power to ionize a different type of fuel, usually an inert fuel like xenon, and then accelerating these ions out of the nozzle using an electromagnetic field. Both engines accomplish the same thing, driving the propellant out the nozzle faster than a chemical rocket can, therefore making the engine more efficient. It uses less propellant to achieve the same delta V, therefore reducing the travel time from Earth to the moon from 3 days to perhaps 1. Now, once again, to be clear, this type of propulsion cannot be used to take off. It has to be used in low Earth orbit. So that being the case, you really need to have this sort of thing deployed ahead of time in order to make sure that it can be used effectively. It's not something you're going to be able to use on the fly, but rather you have to have preparation in low Earth orbit before you make use of this type of propulsion. Right now, the idea is to use chemical rockets in order to achieve orbit, and then to engage your nuclear engines on the upper stage of your rocket, or in the case of Starship, have nuclear engines on that in order to get to Mars in about 3 months instead of 6. But the military is thinking of using this very same type of propulsion in order to get to the moon far more rapidly. Now, in my opinion, the military is not looking at Starship as an effective rapid response solution, simply because Starship requires entirely too much on-orbit refueling before it can go to the moon. So there needs to be another solution that makes use of a small nuclear reactor and a nuclear engine, nuclear thermal or nuclear electric, or perhaps some other solution to reach the moon in short order. In some ways, this could be done more effectively if you deployed an engine in orbit first, and another solution would be this: a mini Starship with a nuclear engine on board. You use conventional Starship to get mini Starship into orbit, and then deploy mini Starship with its nuclear engines on board, fully fueled, and the mini Starship makes its way to the moon at a rapid pace, allowing military assets to reach cislunar space again in about a day's time. This is a solution, of course, that would require the development of an entirely new spacecraft, and SpaceX has not been contracted to do anything like this. Instead, it's Blue Origin that's been contracted to develop a small spacecraft like this that would make use of a nuclear thermal engine. Now, this concept, the Copernicus B, which is over 10 years old at this point, is an idea used for human missions to Mars, a much more ambitious project that really would not be effective for fast response missions. However, I like the idea behind this, and that is to put your nuclear vessel in orbit and to deploy your assets to this vessel when it's time to make use of it. So you use a conventional rocket to reach orbit, transfer your personnel to the nuclear rocket, and then have the nuclear rocket make the 24-hour journey to the moon to respond to whatever crisis is developing there. In my opinion, deploying nuclear assets in orbit is going to be the most effective way to make use of this type of propulsion if you want a rapid response. If you have a fully fueled rocket in orbit at all times ready to take personnel to the moon, this is, in my opinion, the best way in order to make sure that you can secure your resources in cislunar space and to protect them from hostile forces. Now, here's another concept that you may be shocked to learn that I kind of like when it comes to delivering troops to the moon rapidly, and that's using Orion to do it. Yes, Orion is part of the whole SLS setup, but my solution would be to not use SLS, but instead to deliver Orion to orbit using something like Falcon Heavy or Starship or Vulcan, something along those lines. Have the Orion rendezvous with a nuclear engine that's already fueled and has been waiting in orbit for quite some time, and then have the nuclear engine deliver Orion to the moon. Orion is reusable. Orion has been in development for well over a decade, and it would be nice if we could actually make use of this reusable spacecraft rather than restricting Orion to a wasteful and expendable system like SLS. Orion is on the right track simply because it's designed to be reusable. It can carry as many as 6 or 7 personnel to cislunar space. It can do so quickly if it has a nuclear engine for propulsion. Instead of the ICPS, for example, you use a nuclear thermal or nuclear electric engine. And instead of using its cargo to carry moon rocks and scientific samples, you use this excess payload to modify it for military purposes, perhaps adding a lot of ECM or stealth technology to it. A militarized version of Orion, in my opinion, would be a very effective and quick way of getting troops to the moon. On top of that, Orion could actually be in orbit on a military space station with a nuclear engine close by, rather than deploying the troops from Earth. You could have troops on call in orbit 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for use in cislunar space. And by the way, I am in no way suggesting that the Axiom space station be used for military purposes. This is a commercial space station being used exclusively for peaceful scientific objectives. Nevertheless, the idea would be to build a military space station dedicated to the purpose of defending low Earth orbit and cislunar space from hostile forces. Now, you would only go to these kinds of extremes if you had clear evidence that some nation was trying to militarize space, whether that be communist China or somebody else. This would be the only situation to where you would have a dedicated military space station with troops on board ready to respond to a crisis in cislunar space. In the meantime, however, nuclear engines can also be used for military satellites designed to be deployed to cislunar space as well. So if for some reason a hostile force on the moon takes out our satellite assets that are orbiting the moon, being used for reconnaissance or whatever other purposes they might be used for, then you could use nuclear engines to deploy fresh satellites to replace them. It is my sincere hope that we never need a military space station, that we never need armed soldiers in orbit on the moon or any place else. I truly hope that space remains a peaceful place where nations collaborate instead of engage in conflict. But nevertheless, to ignore the strategic importance of the moon is simply an idiotic thing to do. The moon can be employed in a variety of different ways to give a nation enormous strategic advantages here on Earth, and this is not being overlooked either by the Chinese or by the US Space Force. But here's the good news. Next generation propulsion systems that will carry us to the moon, Mars, and beyond no longer have to be exclusively paid for by NASA and their extremely restricted budget. Now we have the US military and their colossal budget behind the idea of developing next generation propulsion. And hopefully this never has to be used for military purposes, but instead gets used in civilian applications, especially in our endeavors to reach Mars in a quicker and safer time frame for our astronauts. Military technology has been used for peaceful purposes in the past over and over again, and it is my sincere hope that that's what happens with this particular contract that's being offered by the US military and is due in just a few days. In the meantime, if you like my channel and you like the topics that I talk about, as varied as they may be, you know how to support me. It's all in the description, and I could definitely use your support at this time. So, until the US military and the US government recognizes the enormous strategic advantage that is in low Earth orbit and cislunar space and develops technology and spacecraft to respond to any particular threat that may arise in the future, until the US government and everybody else recognizes the value that space has to human civilization, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.